$20,000. That's what a three-bedroom brick house cost in the suburbs of Sydney in 1975. Not the deposit, the whole house. Land, bricks, roof, backyard big enough for a Hills hoist and a veggie patch. $20,000. And a working bloke could actually afford it on a single wage. Today, that same house is worth over $1 million, maybe $2 million if it's in a decent suburb. The numbers are so absurd they almost don't feel real. But they are real. And somewhere between 1975 and now, the Australian dream of owning your own home went from normal expectation to impossible luxury. Today, we're digging into the shocking reality of housing prices back then, not just the numbers, but what they meant, how people lived, and what we lost when houses stopped being homes and started being investments. Number 1, ordinary people believed home ownership was their right. This is what we've really lost. In 1975, Australians genuinely believed that if you worked hard, saved sensibly, and lived within your means, you'd own your own home. It was part of the social contract, the Australian dream, the reward for being a productive member of society. That belief shaped policy, shaped behaviour, shaped expectations. Young people planned their lives around eventual home ownership. Parents taught kids to save for a deposit. Schools taught home economics that included budgeting for a mortgage. The entire society was structured around the assumption that ordinary people would own ordinary homes. When that belief dies, and it has died for many young Australians today, something fundamental breaks. If home ownership is impossible, why save? Why work overtime? Why plan for a future that seems permanently out of reach? The psychological impact of losing that dream is enormous, even if we don't talk about it much. The 1975 generation expected to do better than their parents, and mostly they did. They expected their kids would do better than them, and that's where it all fell apart. For the first time in generations, young Australians face a future where they'll likely never achieve the same level of housing security their parents took for granted. Number 2, urban planning prioritised livability over profit. Cities in the 70s were planned for people, not for maximising land values. Suburbs had parks, wide streets, community facilities. Blocks were big enough for kids to play in the backyard. Zoning protected residential areas from overdevelopment. Governments invested in public transport, roads, sewerage and services before releasing land. You didn't buy a block in the middle of nowhere with no infrastructure and hope it eventually got developed. New suburbs were complete communities from the start. There was no obsession with density for density's sake. Yes, apartments existed in the inner city, but suburbs were suburbs low-rise, spread out, green. The idea that you'd knock down a 3-bedroom house to build 6 tiny townhouses would have seemed insane. We built out, not up, because land was plentiful and affordable. Today, urban planning is driven by developer profits and state government revenue from land sales. We cram more dwellings onto less land, call it smart growth, and pretend it's about sustainability rather than profit. The livability our parents took for granted, space, greenery, community, has been sacrificed for density and property values. What part of 70s suburban planning do you wish we'd kept? Number 3, housing wasn't treated as an investment first. This is the heart of it. In 1975, you bought a house to live in. It was shelter, security, a place to raise your family. If it increased in value over time, that was nice, but it wasn't the point. You weren't expecting to get rich from your house, you expected it to keep the rain out and give you stability. Property investors existed, sure, but they were a small minority. The culture didn't celebrate property speculation the way it does now. Flipping houses, negative gearing portfolios, treating shelter as a wealth-building strategy that came later, and it poisoned the market. When housing is primarily shelter, prices stay reasonable because they're tied to what people can actually afford to pay to live somewhere. When housing becomes an investment, prices inflate because investors can pay more than owner-occupiers, can afford to hold properties empty, can outbid young families at auctions. The shift from homes to investments is the original sin of Australian housing affordability. Everything else, the prices, the debt, the inequality, flows from that. In 1975, a house was a home. Today, it's a portfolio asset. That change has made millionaires out of some and locked millions out of ownership entirely. Number 4, renters were a minority and renting was cheap. In 1975, about 65 to 70% of Australians owned their homes. Renting was what you did when you were young, before you bought. It wasn't a permanent state for working families. The idea of renting your entire adult life would have seemed like failure, like something had gone terribly wrong. Rent was cheap relative to wages. You might pay $30 or $40 a week for a decent flat or small house. That was affordable on most wages, which meant you could rent and still save for a deposit. Renting didn't trap you in poverty the way it often does now. Landlords were usually individuals who owned 1 or 2 properties, not massive corporations or foreign investors with portfolios of hundreds. The relationship was more personal. Your landlord lived in the same suburb, understood the local area, and often stayed in for the long term. Rent increases were modest because landlords weren't trying to maximize returns. They were just covering costs and making a bit extra. Today, over 30% of Australians rent, and many will never own. Rent consumes 50, 60, even 70% of income for low-wage workers. Saving while renting is nearly impossible. We've created a permanent renting class, and the 70s generation would be horrified by what we've accepted as normal. Number 5, government policies actively supported home ownership. This is crucial. In the 70s, both major political parties agreed that home ownership was good for society and should be supported. Governments built public housing, offered first home buyer grants, regulated banks to prevent predatory lending, and released land for development. The Commonwealth Bank had a special home loans division that specifically helped first home buyers. Interest rates were capped, lending was regulated, and the goal was to get as many Australians into their own homes as possible. Housing was seen as a social good, not primarily an investment vehicle. Tax policies didn't favour property investors over owner-occupiers the way they do now. Negative gearing existed, but wasn't the massive tax loophole it became. Capital gains tax didn't exist until 1985, so when it was introduced, it was meant to make housing fairer, not encourage speculation. The government's role was to facilitate home ownership, not to let the market run wild and hope for the best. That philosophy shift from homes as shelter to houses as investments is the single biggest reason prices exploded. When governments stopped seeing housing as a right and started seeing it as an asset class, ordinary Australians lost. Number 6, new suburbs were being built for normal families. The 1970s were boom times for suburban expansion. New suburbs were popping up around every major city, designed specifically for working families. Developers weren't chasing luxury markets or foreign investors, they were building for teachers, mechanics, nurses, factory workers. These weren't McMansions or architecturally designed showpieces. They were modest, 3-bedroom brick homes on quarter-acre blocks. Basic, functional, honest housing that normal people could afford. The land was cheap because cities were expanding outward and governments were actively releasing land for development. The suburbs had everything. Families needed schools, shops, parks, community centres. They were planned communities, not just housing estates. Kids could walk to school, mums could walk to the shops, dads could catch a bus or drive to work without spending 2 hours in traffic. Today, new developments are either too expensive for ordinary families or too far from jobs and services. The quarter-acre block has become a luxury. We build tiny townhouses on tiny blocks and sell them for prices that would have bought a mansion in 1975. The suburbs that were built for battlers are now too expensive for their grandkids. Number 7, deposits were achievable in a few years. A standard deposit was 10 to 20% of the house price. On a $20,000 house, that meant saving $2,000 to $4,000. If you were disciplined, lived with your parents for a bit, or rented cheaply and cut back on luxuries, you could save that in 2 to 3 years. Maybe 4 if you were supporting yourself entirely. Young people would open special savings accounts, often with the government that gave bonuses for regular deposits. The system actively encouraged first home ownership. Banks and building societies wanted to lend to young families because that's how communities grew, how economies strengthened, how society remained stable. Compare that to today. 20% deposit on a $700,000 house is $140,000. At that scale, you're not saving for a few years, you're saving for a decade or more, assuming housing prices don't keep rising faster than you can save. For many young Australians, the maths simply doesn't work without help from family. The wealth gap this creates is enormous. Kids whose parents can help with deposits get on the property ladder. Kids whose parents are renters or battlers themselves never catch up. In 1975, your parents' wealth mattered less. Your own work ethic and planning mattered more. That's been completely inverted. Do you reckon you could have saved a deposit in 3 years back in the 70s? Number 8. Interest rates were high, but prices were low. Here's where it gets interesting. Yes, interest rates in the 70s were higher than today, often 8 to 10%, sometimes more. People love to point this out, like it explains everything. But here's what they miss. High interest on a low price is still affordable. If you borrowed $15,000 at 10% interest, your repayments were painful but manageable. You could pay the loan off faster, make extra payments when you had them, and own the house outright in 15 or 20 years. The debt was real money you could actually imagine paying back. Today, you borrow $600,000 at 4% interest, and the repayments are crippling. Even at low interest rates, the sheer size of the debt is overwhelming. You're locked into 30-year mortgages that keep you indebted for your entire working life. And if interest rates rise even a little, thousands of families are suddenly in trouble. The 1970s system was more honest. High interest rates meant you knew exactly what you were getting into. Banks were careful about who they lent to because they needed to be sure you could actually pay it back. Today's system relies on endless price growth and cheap credit, and when either of those fail, the whole thing teeters. Number 9. A single wage could support a family and a mortgage. This is the part that really stings. In 1975, Dad could work one job, not investment banking or corporate law, just a regular trade or office job, and his wage would cover the mortgage. Feed the family, keep the lights on, and still have a bit left over for holidays and savings. Mum often didn't work, not because women couldn't, but because the family didn't need two incomes to survive. When women did work, it was for extras, for security, for career satisfaction, not because the mortgage would default without it. That choice, that option, to have one parent home raising kids without financial catastrophe has completely vanished. The mortgage payments were affordable. You might pay $100 to $150 a month for a house loan. That was manageable on a wage of $500 or $600 a month. Tight sometimes, sure, but doable. You weren't hemorrhaging 60 or 70% of your income just to keep a roof overhead. Today, both partners work full-time, often with side hustles, and they still struggle to save for a deposit, let alone afford the mortgage payments. The entire structure of family economics has shifted. We're working more, earning more nominally, and somehow affording less. The system's broken in a way that would have seemed impossible in 1975. Number 10. The average house price was 3 times the average wage. In 1975, the average Australian house cost around $15,000 to $20,000. The average annual wage was about $6,000. Do the maths, that's roughly 3 times your yearly income for a whole house. Today, the average house costs 10 to 12 times the average wage. Some cities, it's 15 times or more. Back then, if you were a tradie, a clerk, a factory worker, you could save for a deposit while renting, get a loan, and own your home before you were 30. It wasn't easy, you still had to save and budget, but it was achievable. That's the key word, achievable. Not a pipe dream, not something you needed rich parents or an inheritance for, just hard work and decent planning. The banks would lend to ordinary people without demanding massive deposits or perfect credit scores. If you had a steady job and could show you'd been saving, you were a good risk. The system was designed to help people buy homes, not to extract maximum profit from housing scarcity. Young couples would get married, rent for a year or two while they saved, then buy their first house. Not an apartment, not a unit, a house, with a yard. In a decent suburb, that was normal, expected, the natural progression of adult life. Today, couples in their 30s are still renting, still saving, still hoping that somehow the market will become sane again. $20,000 for a house, 3 times your annual wage, a deposit you could save in a few years, a mortgage you could pay on a single income. These numbers seem like fantasy now, like we're talking about another planet instead of the same country just 50 years ago. We can't turn back the clock. We can't unfinancialize housing or undo decades of policy choices. But we can remember what was possible, what we lost, and what we owe the next generation. Because accepting that housing unaffordability is just the way things are, that's giving up on the Australian dream entirely. If this made you angry about what's been taken from young Australians, or nostalgic for a time when ordinary work meant ordinary security, share it with someone who's trying to save for a house today. They need to know it wasn't always this impossible. This was Retro Australia, where the past is still alive.